Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so there's, Ben, you send out a email pretty last minute, but asking for some questions that we could maybe talk about today. Like, talk a little bit about, what that process was, and then kind of how we're structuring this today.
Yeah, I was saying to you before that we often on these sessions, especially I think some of the questions that we get come through on the day usually need a little bit more to think about. So, it's good to be able to have them on the fly, and we want to try and take some more later on. But we really wanted people to have the opportunity to think about it a little bit more and to put them over in advance of it so that we could really go deeper into what was specifically people were looking to find out. Because we run a whole host of these webinars now. We're doing at least one a month, for people who aren't existing students, and then a more in-depth, more detailed one for those who are. But we want to try and make them as personalised for the audience as possible. And with that in mind, I thought, yeah, let's ask people in advance. Let's find out what they want to have. The focus of the session, and so we're gonna go into conversation with Hans van Dam. Hans has seen most of the questions already, so he's got an idea of the type of thing we're going to be discussing. And it was really good for us to see that there were some very clear themes that were coming through. Themes that I must say I hear a lot in my conversations with enterprise companies around the world. So today we're gonna get into it. We're gonna get under the hood a little bit, and we're gonna see how many of these questions we can get answered in the next. We've got an hour in total, about 42 minutes, but we also want to open up to the floor here, so we'll probably spend about 30 minutes going through the questions that came in advance, and then open up to everybody else if we haven't covered what it is you wanted to go through.
Yeah,
so
well said. Great intro. Yeah.
Thank you. I did practice a little bit. I suppose the first one, and this is probably one of the biggest ones. Like we've all heard over the last year, especially, but even going back even further than that, that companies need to care about conversational AI, that this is really important for their future, that this is going to change the way people operate and do business. So the big question then, starting off on a major one, is what does it do for companies, and why should they care?
Yeah. Why are we talking about this? What somebody pointed out to me, I think it was Alan, CTO at Raza. He said that the first Gartner hype cycle that was ever published that had already virtual assistant or chatbot on it. Like it was, and that's like a long time ago. So it's been always something that people have been intrigued by. If like, can we automate conversations using technology? And everybody's always understood that, language in itself and conversations, that's how people think. That's how we use language to describe ourselves and make sense of the world and to get things done and to communicate. So if we can use that and automate that, it's incredibly powerful. And we've seen these different waves of technologies throughout the years, whereas all of a sudden we're thinking, yeah, this is the moment. This is the moment where maybe initially it was like traditional pattern matching, and then it became NLP, and it became more of NLU. And then, you've got Facebook with that massive wave of Facebook Messenger and everybody, and then it's Alexa and Google. So every time we think this might be the moment that it finally happens. And now, of course, with large language models, people are again seeing that dream, or like all of a sudden they're awakened to that dream. It's like, oh yes, this is what we want to do. This is what has a lot of value to both customers and the business, or patients and the hospital. It like can be any kind of a dynamic that you want. So all of a sudden there's this energy again in the industry. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of signal. But that holy grail of conversational AI, it's the question is like, is it like Kafka, where you're never going to get that, or you keep going in circles and you never reach it? Or is it something that becomes attainable over time? And the reason companies are so incredibly excited about this is at the end of the day, we've got automation goals. As a business, what I want to do, there's a few key objectives, and it is to reduce cost. And a way of reducing cost is through automation. So if I have all my processes behind the scenes that are incredibly complex, that if I can automate those processes, and I don't really need a lot of real estate to give access to all those processes, where it's just a conversation, then that allows me to do all the complicated automation work behind the scenes and just give access to that through that conversational interface. So to be, to increase value for shareholders to stay competitive, you need to be a good business and you need to reduce costs. So conversational AI allows you to do that. But another key element of any business is to increase revenue and to increase customer lifetime value, to increase customer satisfaction, which all kind of play together. And if we know that people like language and they enjoy interacting through conversations because it is the most natural thing, then that works for them as well. So automation goals and customer experience goals, they seem very opposing to each other, right? The one seems cold and rigid and the other one seems warm and interesting and fun. But conversational AI allows you to unify those goals and meet both, customer satisfaction and automation goals. That's why there's a lot of value. And if your business is not doing this, but your competitor is, then you're losing. And it doesn't mean you're out, oh, yeah, get a chatbot or you're dead next week. That's not like that, of course. But it is a big trend where we have hyper automation goal and customer experience goals. Me actually, I said, oh wait, I set this up like a minute ago, and I was like, this is cool. I can show this, and then I completely forgot about it. But this is kind of the way to think about it, right? We've got scope and customer experience. We have automation goals on one hand, and then we have customer experience goals on the other hand. And what you're ultimately looking for is hyper automation with a great customer experience. That's what you can deliver through conversational AI, and that's kind of that's why companies are excited about it.
Great, very nice. So happy customers stay longer and spend more.
Pretty much,
That sounds
yeah,
that sounds pretty
yeah.
good. That sounds like a
It's that simple. Yeah,
yeah,
I do think like enterprise a lot of times we get caught up in like, oh, the metric is customer satisfaction or the metric is NPS. It's like, yeah, we care about those things, but why do we care about those things? Because they are indicators of people staying with us longer and spending more money with us. And sometimes it's like, okay, no, this is just an indicator of that they might do that. Where sometimes we're so focused on just those metrics.
yeah, nice. So how is conversation design changing then based on the things that you've just spoken about, the introduction of a lot of those new technologies and new understanding of what's happening in the marketplace?
Yeah. And it has to do with, the noise and signal thing, right? I think the for some people, like, oh, the conversation design is like, oh, how do I build an NLU chatbot? Or like, how do I now, oh, wait, but that's not relevant anymore. How do I then build an LM chatbot? Then we don't need conversation design. A lot of it's the wrong question. I think, ultimately as a conversation designer, what are you interested in or what are you helping a business with? Is, answering the question, what's the kind of conversation that I want to have with people? Who are the people that I'm going to be interacting with? What do they expect? What do they want? What do they want to accomplish? How do they feel about that? And then what is the ideal conversation? Um, that it might be employees, patients, citizens, could be with anyone. That is the fundamental question that, a conversation designer solves. What does the ideal conversation look like, and how do we power that, leveraging technology? And that the technology is changing doesn't really matter because what you're doing is like you're going from a hammer to a drill to maybe an even more advanced machine. But at the end of the day, it's just the objective is the same. The tools are just slightly different. Um, when it comes to conversation design, there are specific design patterns that work that make a good, if you analyze conversations, good conversations follow a certain pattern. The sentences follow a certain pattern. The same way, that text has grammar, like the same way design and chatbot have certain rules that they should follow to have a good experience, to create a good experience. So where maybe, in an NLE chatbot, you've got your team writing those dialogues, where they're actually sitting and, they're saying like, it is the use case, understanding what people need, and then crafting that conversation, writing in those design patterns. If you would now use generative AI, that might create your first draft. Your job becomes more of checking if those design patterns are actually there. So you're still focused on, what's the ideal conversation, which elements should it have, and making sure that it has those elements, whether you write them in or whether you check something else has written it in. So conversation design is changing, but not as much as people want it to change. Or I think if you feel like this is now radically changing, then maybe you've had a somewhat limited perspective on what conversation design was. Because if you look at the fundamental principles of what we're trying to accomplish, there's not a lot different. So now it's like, okay, yeah, prompt design, I can get my first draft faster. Or if I run it in real time, okay, I need to set those rules that we're following those patterns. But if you were doing your job well before, there's so you need to stay updated and keep learning and keep developing your skill set. But at the end of the day, the conversation with customers isn't going to change. It's only going to change slightly different on how you're going to create it.
Great. I'm going to give some work to the post editing team and do this and allow them to put a link into your amazing video on Have I Still Got a Job that you released in around February, which goes into that content in a lot more detail. But one of the questions that does come through and that we saw coming was what a team now looks like. I think people, there's a lot of enterprises who will have had conversation design teams in place, will have, departments that have been being built over the last couple of years, and are now wondering, what does my team look like? What do you think that now looks like in an enterprise organization that is looking to do this on quite a big scale?
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, fundamentally, like, if you look at the dynamic between people and I would say, you've got the creator and then you've got sort of the assistant. So people were creating and AI was assisting them. And over time, AI is going to create more and the people are going to go down to more like an assisting and controlling room, right? So for some organizations, that may take 5 years for that transition where AI gets into the driver's seat and people are sort of supporting the AI. And for others, if you're starting today, you might actually say, you know what, I'm going to try and create LLM powered chatbots now from day one and do it. We've got a few clients like that. It's very interesting how they're doing that. So based on where you are in that transition influences what your team definitely also looks like. Because the kind of question becomes, do you have prompt designers or do you have conversation design? Yeah, you're going to have both, but you could say that, current in the old world, which to be honest, is where most people live and will live for a while. In the real world, um, generally the teams you've got AI trainers, so they're focused on cognition. Then you've got conversation designers that are focusing on the structure of the conversation and the flows and making sure all of that goes neatly. And then, you have like an expert conversation designer, a conversational copywriter that is more focused on tone of voice and has the final, he's the editor in chief of the team, right? And that group of people may be supported by, a bunch of engineers. Then you got product owners around that. There might be someone heavily involved, if you're in a highly regulated industry, focusing on compliancy issues, etc. If you would now go into an LLM powered world, the cognition side, that's going to reduce a little bit. So in the old world, we would say for 3 AI trainers, you have 2 designers and 1 expert designer. So it's like cognition and design are equally represented. Um, Now that's going to change a little bit because a lot of the cognitive stuff is not as intense anymore with all your K-fold testing and running all like so that headcount is going to come down a little bit, but what you'll get is more prompt designers that trying to get an answer from the large language model and making sure it's monitoring. So it's probably that same person, but with a slightly different function. And then the designers and the expert designers. I would say that you're going to be adding more people from a risk mitigation perspective that need to be there, right? Because you're dealing with a black box at the end of the day, so you're never really sure what comes out. So what are the risks there? How do we make sure it's in the right tone of voice? How does it make sure that we don't break any rules, that we're not promising anything that we shouldn't be promising? Um, so quality assurance, risk mitigation become roles within a conversational AI team that are going to be increasingly more important, I would say.
That's amazing, really good stuff. I think one of the things, it's a good opportunity probably to point out to the audience. I think some of the stuff that you mentioned in there, it probably got there were some technical phrases, some technical terms that because this quite a lot of this audience is quite new. A lot of that stuff is covered in the Conversation Design Institute courses. It's a really good way to understand the fundamentals, and the way that the courses are created, it's very much about taking somebody from a beginner right the way through to a practitioner. There's courses based on conversation design, AI training, conversational copywriting. So all of the things that we've just covered there can be brought out from our courses. So great opportunity to go and check those out. I'm sure there'll be a link that will follow in the email that comes up. So
Yeah, I'll add something to this as
yeah,
well. That we very explicitly talk about prompt design. If you go online and you start looking at large language, you see a lot of prompt engineering. And the reason why a lot of chatbots used to fail, or a lot of them still fail, is because they're engineering led. And we've always advocated like that you got to recognize conversation design, because that's the discipline that's going to help you get value from the technology. An engineer will just deploy more chatbots and chuck in more use cases without thinking about the customer experience. So they're focused on scope. They're just automation goals and adding that, but they're not getting value because the experience is so bad. So that's when conversation design became a thing to actually say, okay, let's maybe fewer engineers, let's bring in designers, have them work together more closely so that we actually get value from the technology. And now with generative AI and large language models, you kind of when you see job openings for prompt engineer at an enterprise for a conversational AI team, you already know what kind of mistakes they're going to be making, because they're going to be very much focused on the technical capabilities of the chatbot and not so much on the design aspect. And if you do that, you're just, you know, generative AI allows you to do stuff fast, but also if you're not doing the right thing, it allows you to create very big problems really fast as well. So CDI very much speaks about prompt design rather than prompt engineering, because we're focused on that part of the equation very much. Well, that's where you win the most value as an enterprise.
yeah. I mean, it's a really good point. I mean, I definitely speak to a lot of companies who still see this as an engineering problem. They still see it as IT, and it rightfully is driven by IT. But you're right. There's that focus on design is oftentimes where companies will see a huge change in the outcomes that they actually get.
Mm.
And especially now where people have had these, a lot of the tech's been in place for a few years, they're still not getting what they want, and it's very easy, I think, to try and just add more tech, especially because the
Yeah.
software is moving so quickly at the moment. But if you haven't ever spent any time on that design, it can be a real problem, and you're going to have the same issue in 6 months, 12 months. At some point, you're going to face that same piece. Taking it back a little bit from that, so that's obviously a when you're already down the line, one of the themes of the question were biggest challenges that enterprise organizations face when they're at the start of their journey. So if they have nothing in place, they have no expertise, what are the biggest challenges that they face and that you've seen them overcome over the years?
Yeah, I guess we just talked about a little bit, right? The biggest problem that enterprise, if you don't have anything, yeah, your biggest problem is that tech companies have a lot of money to persuade you and
Yeah,
to get you to buy stuff and buy into their dreams. And they might even take you out to dinner if you're lucky. Um, so yeah, I think there's, the problem is that you have conversational AI is everything, right? Everything in your organization is a conversation, which is really cool and which kind of shows that potential of conversational AI. But the problem is that makes it very difficult at the same time to identify those initial use cases that you might want to tackle, right? So as you're starting out, it's very much an exercise of like, what is some low-hanging fruit, but then what are some mission critical journeys that I want to cover immediately as well, so that I do build up muscle and expertise and this and that. Because if I'm just, I said, oh, low hanging fruit, customer support FAQs, it's like, yeah, everybody knows that. Um, but it doesn't challenge you as much either. So you kind of want to have some of that, and have some mission critical journeys, identify the right use cases there. That is a key step, but also understand what the end goal looks like. If we pull this up again, right? So as you're starting out in that discovery phase, you want to have a good balance between, having some scope, having, some FAQs, having all of that covered, and then having some mission critical journeys, multi-turn things that require some integrations and do all of that. And as you're developing that, you're going to learn a lot about your organization, right? So for us, our thing is always like, you can't just build, you can't just design. It's a combination of a bunch of things, right? It's like, who are the people that are going to be doing the work? Do they have the skill set to do it? Do they have the right support? Is there a conversational culture that's being developed? And do they then have the right tools and technology to actually deliver on that work? And the key thing as you're starting out is kind of understand what does, that first quadrant, what does that look like, in terms of hyper automation with a great customer experience. If we have that, what does that look like? It means that we're going to be on all our channels. So, we need a system that we can plug into all our channels. We can cover all our journeys. So it needs to be plugged into all our backend systems. It needs to be able to handle all these queries. Uh, and then it needs to provide a great experience. And all these things need to, so we kind of understand our destination. Now it becomes, a challenge of finding the best roadmap to get there. And because it's very tricky it's very easy to go from quadrant two, from discovery phase of those initial use cases, having, a team with like some heroes and pioneers that are building that first thing and getting it to work. And then usually what happens is people get excited about it and they scale up, and then they end up in quadrant three, uh, which is where you've just overbuilt. You've added too much scope too quickly, and you didn't really have the skill set to deliver a good experience on that scope, right? And that's when you start losing value. So the trick is to sort of not go overboard in the beginning, to understand the end goal, but to sort of take gradual steps going there. It's like, this is the technology that we want eventually. So what do we need today? But also then, what does the team look like next year, the year after? What kind of budgets does that require? Because sometimes you'll see an enterprise think about, rolling out the technical capability, but not thinking about the budgets too much. So now you're in a phase where you're going to start deploying more complicated use cases that are more personalized, that are more contextual, that require more advanced design, but you've not budgeted for the people to develop themselves into being able to deliver on that scope. And that's those are the things, the budgeting around that, where you're not just focused on the technology, but mindset, skill sets, culture, and systems. You need to educate the stakeholders around that so that you can manage the expectation in the organization. You need to give people the room and time to develop their skill set. You need it's about employee engagement, it's about conversational culture. Technology, you can plug it in and you can scale it rather quickly, but automation does not work without people knowing what they're doing. Um, so as you're starting out, be aware of those things. So you can have the dream and you need to know the dream and you need to know how to get there, but understand that you can only do one step at a time. And that one step should include all elements. So the people, the organization, the technology.
That's great. One of the what level of knowledge do you think people outside of the core team need to have? Do they need to understand what's going on, or is there a level of expertise that they should have in those external stakeholders who aren't part of that design team?
That's a great question. The What we see a lot of times is that because the stakeholders aren't educated, very few people know what you're doing. Like they're thinking like, oh, you're just writing words in a chatbot. Like, how hard can it be? Until they try to do it themselves and they go into chatbot. Um, so it's about creating respect and conversational culture for the design team. Because what happens a lot of times is that we'll create a journey in a chatbot, and then you go to the legal department because they need to sign off on it. But they don't know anything about it. So they just see a bunch of words and then they just say, well, this is not how we talk, right? And they start editing. And then maybe it goes to risk and maybe it go. So what happens a lot of times is that you may have a pretty good design team and they do their best work and they're super excited about it. But now they're going through those stakeholders that don't really know what it is they're looking at. So they just give their feedback and the design gets diluted up to the point where it becomes worthless. Now, that is going to decrease the performance of your chatbot, but also it's going to sort of kill the mindset of your team. They're going to lose motivation. So now all of a sudden, all these individuals, they're losing motivation. They're frustrated that they don't know how to, that they don't have the skill set and the means to get these stakeholders on board. You're not getting the results. So stakeholders start looking at other projects because this one's not performing so well. So it is very important that you develop that culture. And one way of doing it is by having internal meetups where you educate people. Sometimes you bring them in and make them part of the design process. And you need to build trust and show them that you know what you're doing. And there's also tools for that. I mean, you want to have a style guide, you want to have a persona document that says, how does my bot talk. That helps with consistency in creating a bot. But it's also a document that once it's signed off on, it creates authority. Because now you can go to legal and be like, no, but this is how we do it at the chatbot. We know what we're doing. We figured this out. We've done the research. This is the tone of voice. This is how we say things. We respect your opinion. We want your feedback, but we'll take it from here. Right. So it's about building up that confidence in the design team and educating the stakeholder that is going to give you the freedom and the room to actually deliver on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, yeah, I can
So,
definitely say that, that's very evident in organizations that I speak to, where they've done that prep in advance, where they have that confidence. If they've got, if the bot is called Bob, they will fight for Bob much more than if Bob doesn't have that persona, if they don't have that level of insight into it.
yeah, definitely makes sense. Let's see let's see, we got we'll do all those questions at the
Yeah,
end. We're 33 minutes in. Let's see if we got a bunch there.
yeah, we've got a few questions coming through, a couple more that came through in advance. And one I think that's really important, especially with and you kind of spoke about it a little bit in there, but we know that there's this expectation that organizations have. We've all seen the movies, we've all
Mm.
watched the TV show, and everybody wants to, buy their bot out of a box, plug it in, and suddenly it could do everything. It's talking to you like your best friend. And then oftentimes people try and create that level of automation. It doesn't necessarily it can't deliver through it. So where do you think, how can you strike the balance? How can organizations, when they're doing this, when they're actually building it, strike that balance between automation through chatbots and having the personal touch?
I think there is no automation without experience because it's just going to sit there collecting dust. And so a lot of times what they'll say is like, oh, let's get it to work functionally. Let's make sure it works. And now we'll think about experience afterwards. And then they'll start investing it, and then, you know, that's it. So the only way to really make sure you do this is to be human centered from the ground up. We've got this model where we kind of talk about the different design patterns that you need per level of an AI assistant. And it's a chatbot's like it's like a human starts out, can't really do much, and then it gets more skills and gets more connection to the real world and people around it, to become a fully integrated beautiful human being. But before the first level that we identify as in terms of practices that need to be implemented is to be human centered, have diversity in our team so that you embed inclusivity from day one, to have goal oriented mindset of trying to help customers. And I think if you start with that before you build anything, then you're always embedding that in what you build. And I think that is key. And always ask yourself the question: is this still a human experience? Would you want to actually talk to this? When you create something, say the words out loud. If it sounds bad, then you probably don't want to push it live and make it better. So there's all of that within the scope of the chatbot that you can do to have those things as foundational building blocks. And then, of course, as a human element, it's also, don't get rid of your agents too soon. Like make sure there's always, never a dead end street. Always have a good destination for people if you can, even if you can't help them. So putting that front and center before you build anything, that you're actually talking to people, is key. And if you simply put that up on a wall with those questions, is this still human? I think you're going to do a much better job than if you just put engineers in a room and start building. And that's how you find the balance. And I think doing small steps at a time, considering all elements, asking those right questions and making them front and center. It's not just, it's not just hippie stuff. Inclusivity is not like, oh, it's nice for marketing to be super inclusive. No, it's like you could be alienating customers by not thinking about it. And it's not out of bad intention. It's just like, oh God, yeah, we were just, if I put, three people in a room that look like me and see the world like me, yeah, we're going to create something that's going to work very good for me. Um, so have diversity on the team, right? And have it be a reflection of your audience. And those sort of things, it's not just like, good PR slogan. It's just, you're going to be able to help more people in better ways, and it's going to help your business.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think it's really important and well worth focusing on a lot. And one of the questions you spoke a little bit there, it ties in with some of the questions that came through. Companies are looking at it as an engineering problem. Companies are having, tech people look at this. But what if you've got, if you want to advocate, you work in a company and you want to advocate for a conversation design and copywriting positions to be brought in? What's your advice on how to start that conversation and the types of measures that people are going to look at to prove the ROI?
Yeah, I mean, if you bring in the design, what you're immediately going to see is that you're going to have higher completion rates, right? Because all of a sudden you're talking to people that makes, it's important to understand what people say, but it's just as important for people to feel understood because it's going to increase motivation. They're going to continue the journey with you in a more easy way. So if you are desperate to promote conversation design in your organization, that probably means that you get some bad numbers, that something's not working because otherwise they would have already adopted this. Right. So I think with all of that, uh, actually, like, promote it in a way where you should have the stakeholders talk to it. Actually, if you want to have that breakthrough moment of getting them to see, like, hey, we need design. There's a lot of times people in the organization that never even talk to the bot, go to bot, show why it's wrong, show how it could be done better, and why it's a skill set you need to invest in, right? And that's why we're now very keen to sort of promote those design patterns at different levels, where you can just say, well, actually, this is the type of bot that we currently have. We should be delivering up to these standards, these design patterns, because CDI is promoting that. We're not even close, so we need to invest in conversation design to close this gap. Um, that's how you sort of advocate for being scaled up. But then what is the outcome for the organization? Well, ultimately, you're going to have, happier customers, you're going to have higher completion rates. And those things allow you to increase scope and hit more automation goals as well. So that's the kind of how you end up calculating that ROI. And the key metrics eventually for an organization are, viable automation rate. So what can we automate? What percentage of that are we automating? Then the cost per automation. So you want to be about 1/10 of the cost of a live chat and customer satisfaction. Those are the three things you're measuring. And if you don't have design, uh, you have a very high automation rate, but you're not people aren't engaging with it. So satisfaction is low, cost per automated chat is super high because you don't have completed journeys. So that's kind of how you make the equation and build the case.
Yeah, and right back to the first point, happy customers stay longer, and spend more, and that's where that ROI proof comes from. So if somebody is working in an organization and they have a chatbot already, how can they understand if it's underperform or if it's performing as well as it could be?
The easiest way to do that is actually just compare it to these design patterns that we're talking about, right? And we now also offer like a very nice thing. It's like a free chatbot evaluation, pretty much, right? So uh, you check in with us, we'll have a look, we'll build that report and show you, like, oh, actually, against those design patterns, based on what you're trying to do, this is what you should set. We test you against those design patterns. You're either performing properly, you're underperforming, or you're already excellent. Could be either, right? But a lot of times you'll get very specific instructions on how to do it better, and that is going to inform your roadmap as well. And you're doing this with a lot of people right now, so like maybe you can talk a little bit more about like the detailed process of that offering that we have now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the process is really simple. We get our experts to take a high level look at what's been built, around the conversation design element, and it's very much been designed with that thought process in mind of being able to show somebody exact areas for development. It also, we find a lot of people who work in the design part of the organization, they understand it, they get that there's that need to focus on design, but they don't necessarily have the language that they need to be able to go to their senior management and say, here's what I would be changing if I could. So the review can work really well from both ends. If you're a senior person inside an organization, you want to understand better what the team's built, it's a brilliant thing to take on board. Or if you're in an organization and you want to build the case for more investment into training or development or expansion of the team, then the review can be a really good step for you on that. And the report that you get at the end of it is detailed enough that you can actually make tangible steps with it, make changes, and then show the difference in the outcomes once those changes have been made. So it's a really good step for anybody who's looking to improve the outcomes they're getting from their existing chatbot.
Nice.
And so one of the other
Let's look at
wrapping up
some.
the yes, it's one of the
Yeah.
questions that we've got coming in from before. It's the last one we've got, and then we'll move into some of the questions that we've got that
Hmm.
have come in live during the call. So if anybody hasn't asked a question yet and they've got one, now's a great time to post it in there. But what do you think the future relationship will be between
Hmm.
websites and conversational interfaces?
Yeah, that's actually excuse me, interesting question, right? Because if you can solve it through conversational AI, then you kind of don't need a website anymore, right? Because it's the least amount of real estate that you need to deliver. Kind of touched on the point. So CDI, what we teach, our fundamental courses are voice first, technology agnostic. So technology agnostic because you need to be able to deliver with any technology because we're focused on the conversation. But it's voice first because if you can do it with voice, then it's the bare minimum. Like it's the least amount of real estate that you can have in voice. So doing it voice first allows you to then also transfer it to chat. It allows you to transfer it to third-party chat apps. Like you can go anywhere, but you can't transfer it back, right? So if I build a chatbot for WhatsApp, I cannot use it in my IVR. Whereas if I actually design voice first without, really nothing, just open form voice first, then I can use it on WhatsApp, in my app, on my website, anywhere. So with that in mind, if you actually solve the problem through that conversation, then what are you going to be using the website still for, right? I think the coolest way to think about it eventually is like if you could do this very well, then it becomes a multimodal experience where you know what the journey is. You could carry it through the conversation, but if you go to the website, you have visual aids supporting it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the website always becomes a conversation, but it is structured as such. And in a way, websites kind of are, right? Because you have a question, you go to the website, you kind of get an answer to the question that you had. So it is almost like a dialogue between two things, but you can bring them way closer together so that you can help people without the website, but you can kind of use the same structure and the same journey when they are on the website. Uh, so it's just you're designing the journeys and then you apply them in different channels with different interfaces and sometimes in a multimodal way. Um, yeah, so let's go to some of these other questions. I think I see the first one here. What's the role of conversation design in content strategy? How can it help startups and scale ups grow? Um, Second part, I'm not really sure, but I think the first part is kind of maybe what we're just talking about, right? It's like actually, how do I give access to my content? How do I use it? How do I, have the conversations that I want to have with people? The one way of doing it, is when people check in with a question or some sort of request that I want to do something. At the end of that conversation, it always gives you the opportunity to talk about something else as well. So if you're thinking about, how can I grow the business, or how can I get them to interact with specific content, or maybe have a branded experience. At the end of their service query, you can then guide the conversation to what it is you want to talk about. So in that regard, conversation design, conversational AI is a tool to just create more touch points, create longer interactions, and guide the conversation to what you want it to be about. Um, So the second question, I think we've covered that, right? The advice on
Yeah, yeah.
proving ROI. Yeah, we've covered that. Fascinating talk. Wow, David, that's so nice of you. Currently, copywriter for contracting and QA. Where did it go? I'm reassuring to hear your thoughts. My question as a copywriter, who have you seen doing the most interesting LM chatbots with fine-tuned tone of voice for the brand? What would you suggest for a copywriter trying to yeah, so I guess that's the interesting question from copywriter. If we look at, enterprises in the past 2, 3 years, the person they really wanted to hire, and that was the most difficult to find, was that expert copywriter. That is kind of like the editor-in-chief of the team that really focuses on tone, that really knows how to drive behavior, and senior copywriters. They can really make a big difference on those teams. Um, so it was almost like a quality assurance role, fine tuning, polishing stuff up. That's a high in demand role, and it still is. And then if you now go to LLM powered chatbots, that's the same problem that is going to be the most difficult as well, right? So yeah, so who is doing the most interesting fine-tuned LM stuff right now? There's not a lot at enterprise level that have these types of chatbots in production. So everybody's experimenting behind the scenes, trying to figure it out, but there are certain risks that they don't like. Because at the end of the day, it's a black box. What comes out, is it good? It often, large language models tend to violate a lot of the basic design patterns. Um, I think the reason for it is that they're overtrained on marketing copy, which is snappy, which has questions mid-sentence, which is something you don't want to do in chatbots. So it's difficult to answer who's doing the most interesting work. But as a role in protecting that tone of voice as a senior copywriter is going to be a high in demand thing. And there are two ways of looking at that role, like increasing the experience, but I would explore position it very much as mitigating risk from an enterprise as well, because you simply do not know what's going to come out of that system. And we're also developing a tool that's going to help with that and make that problem a little easier to solve. Um, but yeah, I don't know if it answers that entirely, but that's kind of where I would try to land as a copywriter pivoting into conversation design.
Yeah.
Uh,
Adding to that just a little bit as well, I think, as you say, I speak to a lot of students who are coming from different disciplines, and adding the conversation design fundamentals to somebody who's already got a really strong knowledge of copywriting can be a very, very quick way to make yourself very, very advanced across the industry as a whole.
yeah, yeah, because you'll have if you've got the 15 years of advanced copywriting and you're learning about conversation design, then it's like, oh wow, that makes sense. You start applying it way faster. Whereas a lot of people are just, are sort of entering and they also got to learn that whole copywriter's mindset as well. Um, That's another one here, kind of interesting question. So we're trying to implement effective chat funnels for lead generation. What's the benefit of doing that? Learning about this stuff with CDI versus with ManyChat or a school of bots, which is also like how to build lead funnels. Um, you come to CDI as like if you're an enterprise, we believe every enterprise will develop a conversational AI capability. You're going to use AI to talk to people. That is a very big deal because you want to respect those people, you want to help those people, you want to drive value for both the business and those people. You come to CDI to learn that skill set and develop that capability. If you're so it's a much bigger issue and problem and challenge to solve. Where if you look at, and I'm not familiar with the details of ManyChat school or in general, but A lot of people use that for, we've got one channel, we want to have a little chatbot here. How do we, have a little dialogue, do one journey, trying to turn it into leads? It's like it's that use case. Um, it's smaller in scope. So yeah, it's a bigger capability that you're developing, a bit bigger skill set that you're developing at CDI. Then I would also say if you're particularly interested in persuading people and building leads and getting people to do what you want, the origin of CDI on top of fundamental conversation design is behavior design. And what that means is that we have an entire toolkit that's based on a psychological model by BJ Fogg, by Cialdini, lots of other behavioral scientists that allow us to guide behavior based on understanding their motivations, their ability, and having the right prompts to move them. So you're going to learn at CDI about using social proof, anticipatory enthusiasm, scarcity, expectation management. These are actually things that are particularly helpful in these types of lead generation situations. Um, they're very advanced. They're kind of at level two conversation design. But yeah, if you're really so, I think if you want to create like a little lead generation chatbot and you want to figure out how to do that with ManyChat, you go there. They'll teach you how to implement that. That's going to be fine. If you're an enterprise, you want to develop a program of like, how do I use conversational AI to guide behavior, to get people to sign up, to buy my products, and all those things, then you're really going into the behavior design toolkit, which we have implemented or combined with conversation design. And that's kind of our massive differentiator from day one in this market. They, uh, do you have any tips on how to design a prompt that is able to switch between, the jumps, being short, concise, empathetic, and serious when it comes to sensitive matters, and also be able to be so design a prompt that can switch based on context. Is that kind of what we're seeing there, I guess, right? Tips on able to switch between being short, concise, and empathetic, and serious when it comes to sensitive matter. So I guess, yeah, like, and assuming this would go into a large language model where you say like answer this like a chatbot in a serious tone when this is the case, answer it in a more concise, friendly tone when this is the case. Uh, yes, yes. I mean, the thing is, it's rather ambiguous question still, but I think, what this has to do is when you're using you design a prompt to interact with a large language model. So you're trying to get something out of that model. Then you could say, answer this question, or, look up this stuff, answer this question. But you could also say, look up this stuff when the situation is X, answer the question this way. When the situation is Y, answer the question that way. And you start creating these variations based on context, um, which is not the hardest thing to do in the world. But let's now say you have a chatbot with a lot of scope and you have some key journeys in which it's very important to make this distinction. So if you create this super detailed prompt going into a large language model, what you're basically trying to do is control the output of that large language model. And the more detailed and forced your prompt is going to be, then what you're doing is so controlling it so much that you might as well write the answer yourself and design the conversation. Once where you could say, people have insufficient funds, then this is the answer, this is the dialogue. And if they have sufficient funds, then this is the dialogue. And you fully take control and you mitigate all risk. You don't have all the API calls going into that large language model, and you're not dealing with latency as much as well. So tips, I guess then if we summarize that a little bit, it's like, oh yeah, right in the context, you can do that, but also be very clear on whether this is then still a right use case. Once you start adding in too much context, you should ask yourself, is this really worth it still? Um,
On just on that point as well, we still have our promotion running on the prompt design course that we're running, so it's running at 50% discount at the moment. Again, here for the editing team to go and get on the site, and you can check out some of the you can download the syllabus for that first, get an idea of what's in there. But again, the feedback that we're getting is definitely amongst the best courses that's on the market at the moment in this area. So if this is something you really want to understand better, that is something where Hans goes into hours and hours of details of those kind of tips and tricks and how to make the most from it.
Yeah, and it's also like it's we kind of look at it from the enterprise perspective, where you might not be running a model real time yet, but it's good to already today, as a conversation design team, to just use Chat GPT on the side, so that you develop a relationship with a large language model, and just start to understand what input versus output, how those things work. You start developing the muscle and the skill set. So when the organization is ready and it wants to bring in these technologies into production, your team is already equipped to really understand those dynamics. Um, Example of a company that has come a long way in terms of maturity with conversation design, brand experience, and CRM integration. Um, so there's one team that we're currently working with. They're in London. They work in the financial sector, and I think what's nice about teams like them, um, and you'll see quite a bit of this. Like what they've been doing this for a while, and they've been investing in it for a long time, and they have all the technical integrations. So the CRM integrations, they're already spot on. They know everything about everyone, but they've never really been able to figure out how to leverage that. And you now see them slowly, develop into that and taking it on in a very serious matter, and investing in design. I think that companies like that, where you see them catching up. So if we go back to the, I still showed. Oh no, wait, that's the different one. I was looking at the bot thing here just now. I guess my slide changed. Where you like the hardest thing is like when you start out in that discovery phase, and then you go in that squandering quadrant where you've built the scope but you don't have the experience yet. It is incredibly difficult to get back on track. Um, so you'll find a lot of organizations that are heavily investing in that. The problem is it's not always as visible as you'd like it to be, because there's still a lot of like legacy stuff in that chatbot. But if you know like the right journeys, you'll find sort of the little gems that are improving and that are working better, and they're slowly adding to the scope. So I think for all those enterprises that have these big use cases that have a lot of traffic, it is not as obvious always how good a job they're doing. Because you don't, from the outside, it might seem like it might not seem that interesting, but actually the numbers might be really good. Because if it's designed properly, you hardly even notice it. Like you only remember the chatbot when it was really bad, and sometimes like you interact with it and you're like, oh, all right, move on with your life. And you wouldn't tell anyone like, oh, I just talked to the most amazing chatbot that did such a good job, because it was a seamless experience. I know it's not satisfying, but I'm not gonna name the companies directly. But I think at the enterprise level, the thing to understand is that it doesn't always show, and it's never easy, and everybody's had their failures and their missed investments, and that is very tricky. So if I then if there's one that we're kind of working with that is starting from scratch and is doing this, they're doing a great job, because they're very delicate, and they do lots. They're one of the Asian super apps. They have lots of conversations. They do millions a week, and they just have a few use cases. They start doing the LLM. They start. They're very delicate about everything they do, and it's amazing. So it's also kind of depends per organization what good looks like, because what might be the biggest challenge for an engineering focused company might be to have the right tone of voice, where for a content focused organization the biggest challenge might be to actually get the stuff to work functionally. So sometimes it's more about what was the biggest obstacle to overcome internally. I don't know, it doesn't feel satisfying as an answer, but it's the best I can do. Sorry, man. I
And
see some regular ones in the chat here too. Yeah.
Yeah, we are at 4 o'clock now, so we've just hit it. I can see the numbers are going down a little bit as well. So I don't know if you wanted to just wrap up any sort of closing thoughts, and we
How do you think?
can.
Oh, this is interesting. So this is what, how do you detect the input for your profiling and influencing the behavior is a sentiment analysis. So this is, I think this is a very interesting thing that is the threat throughout all of this. If you say, oh, it's a sentiment analysis, that's an engineering question. Oh, do we have sentiment analysis? Cool. What was the sentiment? Oh, wait, that's context. We changed the whole thing. Where actually, if you have a designer in the room, it's like, oh, how do people feel when there's insufficient funds and they're trying to buy something? They feel upset. If I now design a conversation, they're upset. What does that mean? When people are upset, they're high in energy, they're not going to listen very well. So now what do I need to do? I need to calm them down, put them in a state where they are receptive to the help that I'm offering. How am I going to do that? I'm going to design for empathy, right? I'm going to design for empathy that is going to increase their ability to actually receive the information that I'm giving them, and that I'm going to guide them through the journey. And so the trick is more about it, or the skill is not about chucking technology at it. It's about understanding your customers, understanding their worlds, understanding their needs and emotions, and then with true empathy, guiding them through the journey. And if you start looking at the problem that way, then sometimes you'd be like, why do we have all this technology? You're like, why are we doing this? Shouldn't this be easier? What's the conversation that we want to have? And then let's power that through technology. And that's how it works with the behavior design as well. It's like we want them to do this. All right, where are they now? This is where they need to go. How do we talk to them in a way that they get there? And you don't need technology to understand that people are upset when their account's blocked. Final words. I see one thing though. I want to see this real quick. Any tips for educating policymakers on the need for conversation design? Um, what do you say, Ben? What's your opinion there? You're
Yeah, I was avoiding that one actually on purpose. Um, Really, because I mean I'm not entirely sure what it means. Like policymakers, obviously, for it. Do you mean from a like government perspective, or policymakers like internally inside an organization, as in like the stakeholders, etc., etc.? Yeah, I didn't really know
I
government
will.
perspective.
I'll provide an answer, and I'll do some self promotion here. I say send them this TED talk. We got to bring in the poets. Let policymakers know that in order for AI and humanity to develop together and to be well off together, we shouldn't treat this as an engineering problem, but um, as a problem that requires philosophers and thinkers and poets. And we got to bring in the poets. So whenever you're near an AI project, whenever you're near a tech project, ask where the poets are. And policymakers should understand that there's millions of people there that maybe dreamt of being a writer, of a creative, of a copywriter, of an artist, of a philosopher, of a historian, that those people are not out of work because of AI, but they're the ones that make AI work. Wow, that's a good line. I never said it like that before. But
Uh,
so I think that would be something to tell your politicians, policymakers, to consider that these people are needed, and that's the way to think about AI. We got to bring in the poets. And on that note, thank you so much, everybody. This was fun. Let us know if this format was kind of fun for us, but because we could just sort of have a conversation. So let us know if that worked for you in the chat as we're kind of closing off.
yeah, so everybody, we're gonna. Oh, I need to pull my laptop off. So the recording of this will get sent around. We'll put some of the things that we discussed into it as well. So there'll be a link in there for some of the courses that we mentioned. There'll be a link in there as well. If you want to take advantage of the chatbot review that we've got while it's still being offered for free, sign up for that. Just leave a few details in there. It will come through to the team over here, and we'll arrange a time have a conversation and move through that. Yeah, aside from that, we look forward to seeing you at the next one we do in this format or another, when we bring back this super team of people.
Yeah. And also put in your calendar April 24th to 26th in Barcelona. You're going to go to Barcelona. Everybody here, you are cordially invited to join us in Barcelona for the first real Conversations Design, or it's not even called Conversations Design Festival, but CDI conference beyond borders. It's going to be an amazing event, lots of speakers. There's an academic track, there's an enterprise track. We're going to do deep breathing sessions with Wim Hof. We're going to have ice baths. We're going to bring in DJs from Amsterdam and celebrate everybody and everyone that is part of this wonderful community. And also, if you're building awesome stuff, we will have awards. For enterprise tracks, like how are you performing? Um, it's all run through CDI Foundation, which is our nonprofit that develops standards and gives out scholarship to make this industry more inclusive and diverse. Thank you so much.
Take care. See you soon.